Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders, viewable on M. Oppenheim TV and YouTube. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we're talking with three magnificent botanical garden leaders: Michelle Conklin, President and CEO of the Tucson Botanical Garden and board member of the American Public Gardens Association; Patrick MacRae, CEO of Land and Garden Preserves in Seal Harbor, Maine; and Stephanie Jutila, CEO of the Toronto Botanical Garden in Ontario, Canada. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited. First of all, living, growing things are part of our lives, but particularly if we live in urban areas, and I've moved from an urban area to a more rural area, particularly if we live in urban areas, it is just so important to be connected to what is grown, what we eat, how we actually as a species evolved. Talk a little bit, Michelle, about why you got into this space of botanical gardens in the first place.
Well, I've got probably a little different kind of take on my journey into botanical gardens because my background was really business as well as music, theater, and art. But I was recruited to come to the garden. I remember the first question they asked me is, "Are you a gardener?" And I said, "Well, actually, my idea of gardening is to put the vase of fresh flowers on the dining room table." But I loved gardens, and I had been visiting gardens since I was a little kid. My first one was in Toronto. But art and science and culture and gardens all blend together so beautifully. So it was, for me personally, really a natural fit.
So that to me is so fascinating, and it's also so true, right? There are a lot of different disciplines that come together when you're managing an institution that is welcoming visitors. Right, Patrick? I mean, you really have to think in business terms, but you're also dealing with growing things, and you're dealing with staff who are horticulturalists, you're dealing with arborists, you're dealing with all these different skills, and you're marketing an experience, right?
You're actually in our garden. I run a cafe, I run a butterfly house, I have scientists, I have educators, I have marketing folks, I have event folks. So yeah, it's really a broad range of people, which takes a lot of people's skills to manage that.
And Patrick, talk a little bit about your trajectory. How did you get here?
It's funny, I actually started in the academic realm. I was at Cornell for a long time and did my undergraduate and graduate work in animal science and then plant science. So I always kind of thought that I would stay in academia. And then suddenly I was captured by the bug of the artistry of gardening and started to think about the aesthetics of fine horticulture. And so eventually I ended up working at an art museum that had historic gardens on the property, and I was running the gardens. And so it's funny when Michelle talks about her background as touching on the arts and music and theater and all these different interesting creative pursuits. Mine ended up doing the same thing, but I never expected it to. And now I'm running a series of gardens that are all about celebration of the art of gardening. And so it is fun that botanical gardens or horticultural institutions more broadly can be so many different things. There are still institutions that are very much science-based and aesthetics is not really a part of it, and that's great. There are institutions that are super outward focused and focused on the public and community outreach, and that's fantastic. And then there are organizations like mine where you're stepping into a living work of art, and there are all sorts of complexities around that. And so you're right when if you're conserving your painting, that's a specific professional discipline. When you're conserving a living, breathing work of art that has to change a little bit every year, but not too much, you're dealing with pest management, and science, and horticulture, and understanding how color theory works, and all these different things. And so it's fun as you lead an organization like this to get to be a generalist and just surround yourself with people who are the specialists in all those different aspects. I think it's the best industry you could possibly choose to work in.
And Stephanie, how did you come to this place of running the Toronto Botanical Garden?
It started long ago, back in high school days, when people started saying, "What do you want to do for a career?" And my one word answer was, "I want to work with plants." Right? plants was the answer. And I didn't know what that meant. Probably similar to Patrick, that went on a journey and studied many different aspects of it. But nothing was complicated enough, right? So if you go to a landscape and you install a landscape, you'll never see that landscape again, right? You walk away as a crew member and you don't get to invest in long-term bench scientists. You don't get to deal with the people and the plants. And when I discovered public horticulture, I never looked back, and it's been about 3 decades.
So the thing that I think is so interesting here is, and it's so true, when we conduct searches for leaders like you, sometimes we start off with a board that thinks that there's one ideal person, there's one ideal candidate, but there isn't, is there, right? Michelle, you have a different sensibility. Stephanie, you have a different sensibility. Patrick, you have different ingredients here. You're all successful within the context of your organization, but Stephanie, you're very different than a Michelle, and your initial career, how it unfolded, is different from Patrick's, right?
So, indeed. And the reality is that to be in this position, leading a cultural institution, leading a botanical garden, you have to be multifaceted in your skill set, but you also have to know how to activate it in others. You're often leading people who are doing a job that is not your specialty. And I think that's the best part. And the fact that we're not doing one thing, we have many distinct parts of our business, our collections, our management, our community relationship, and it takes really a diverse group of people who can actually represent the community you're serving at such a very unique way, where a business that's just selling coffee or a business that's just selling art on the wall, it is a more single slice. We are a very breadth of our community and what our community needs.
That is so well said. I'm really fascinated with that topic of how we assemble teams and so on. Of course, it's my profession. But before we go there, let's go through the various, because you have 3 very different gardens and pieces of land here. So, Patrick, let's start with you in Seal Harbor, and then Michelle, if you can talk a little bit about Tucson, and then we'll round it up with Stephanie again. Patrick, talk a little bit about Seal Harbor. Now, that's the one garden amongst these that I haven't visited. Describe what I would experience if I came.
Well, you'll have to come visit because it is almost indescribable. It is. We live in one of the most beautiful places on the entire planet. Seal Harbor is on Mount Desert Island, which is where Acadia National Park is. And the Land and Garden Preserve is a collection of 3 historic gardens here on Mount Desert Island that spans about 4 miles from Seal Harbor to Northeast Harbor. And we also have 1,400 acres of natural lands and a growing production facility. It's a pretty complex organization where the historic gardens are very interesting because 2 of them were formed by amateur gardeners, and they're some of the best examples, in my opinion, of very, very high quality amateur gardens that I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of them. I used to work for the Garden Conservancy, and so I was traveling and visiting great amateur gardens, and we've got some of the best. And then the kind of crown jewel of our collection of gardens is the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Garden, which was created by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and Beatrix Farrand, who was one of the most prominent women landscape architects of the early 20th century. And so we have this really interesting collection of works of art, sort of like folk art in the amateur realm, and this wonderful professional garden. And then these natural lands, which adds a whole different dimension of the experience. And so when you come to the Land and Garden Preserve and you have the opportunity to see these 3 different gardens with wildly different character and histories, we get to be the steward of all of that. And the thing that I think is most important to me is that each of those gardens and the natural lands they contribute to the cultural fabric of what makes Mount Desert Island so special. And so when we're thinking of stewarding the gardens, it's not just taking care of these living, breathing works of art, as I've already said. It's that we're really caring for the character of what makes this island a really interesting place. And it is fascinating here. It has this wonderful, long tradition of intellectuals coming and summering here. Of course, it has the connection with the Rockefeller family and other prominent families that have been spending time here for over 100 years. And that has contributed to just this real richness of culture on the island. And without that, and without the preserve helping to steward that, then it becomes another tourist destination. And you've got this fantastic national park, but like, where's the cultural context? And so that's what we're trying to take care of. And it's incredibly exciting, but it is very different from many, and if not most, botanical gardens all across the country.
And you're talking, Michelle, about here in Tucson, totally different environment, right? I mean, just the weather is completely different. And then you're also expanding, I understand. Talk a little bit about the garden in Tucson.
Yeah, well, we are a garden that is 5.5 acres, although we are purchasing property to double the size of our property. But we are right in the middle of an urban city. So we're surrounded on two sides by a neighborhood, on one side by a shopping center. So we're a little pocket in Tucson of respite and beauty and quiet and safety. We've got 19 pocket gardens at the Tucson Botanical Gardens. So it's a place that you come and you're able to get away from that hubbub of the city and explore beautiful little gems of a garden, including a barrio garden. We're only an hour from Mexico. So our population is very diverse, and it's a tourist-driven community as well, which so we experience the opposite of what Patrick and Stephanie experience. In the summer, our visitation goes down quite a bit, but not to zero, because it's still beautiful in the morning and beautiful towards the end of the day when the sun starts to set. Yeah, we are a private nonprofit too, so we rely on those tickets and admissions and facility rentals and cafe income. And we've got a cafe. We have 4 indoor galleries. As I said, 19 gardens, an indoor tropical butterfly house, lots of educational programming, and lots of events.
The thing that I think is so fascinating about Tucson is that, first of all, it's the landscape is stunningly beautiful. However, I had not, before I visited the garden, and this was a previous iteration of the garden, as you say, it's changed quite a bit over the last several years. But before I visited the garden, I hadn't imagined that a place like that existed, and it really is it's not like I would imagine Seal Harbor as being, where you're going to Seal Harbor, right? You know where you're going to. In Tucson, it's a little bit different. You kind of have to stumble upon it, or you know about it already.
And actually, it was a private home back in the 1930s, and our garden is 70% under shade cover because the family that owned it was one of Tucson's first nursery home managers, owned a nursery just down the road. So you're able to see the history of gardening from the Sonoran Desert from the 1920s all the way through today's contemporary xeriscape practices. So it gives you a real glimpse not only of our garden, but of the history of gardening in the desert.
And Stephanie, Toronto is such a hospitable place for growing things, right? I mean, it's just you have real seasons, right? You have real weather. You're blessed with good rain and a great climate. So talk about the dimensions of the Toronto Botanical Garden and also its origins.
So our origins are very interesting, and to hear that we're all connected to a former estate or a former home is really important, because our future of public spaces and our future of gardens is often tied to a private estate at one point. So we were a private estate. We were far out from the city of Toronto when 60 years ago, the landowner refused to sell to a developer. The garden is in the midst of what is Toronto's first planned community, or Canada's first planned community. And the developer, of course, was offering money for this large expanse of land. And the homeowner, the property owner, said no, sold it to the city for far less than what they could get from the developer, with the stipulation there would always be natural green space, and it would always be free to the community. And that was our first philanthropic move, right? It's a beautiful gift back to the city. And the city has grown and wrapped its arms around the city. We have towers and cranes in the air all around us because that development, the city pressure is real. We have more than 3 million people in Toronto, and we're one of the world's most diverse and livable cities. And part of this livable nature of our city is that we also have the largest urban ravine system in all the world. And so the glacial activity caused melt. We have creeks and rivers that go all across our city. And that means that we have this natural network of bike trails and places that people can connect from their home to natural green space. And we're in one of those spaces. We're about 34 acres, this entire park, but the botanical garden itself is just a handful of acres. And we've been working with the City of Toronto for many years to map the plans that we would continue to expand the botanical gardens programming and footprint, and that is work in the future. But right now, much like Michelle, we're just this pocket of a handful of acres with lots of different experiences in it. And then we have the benefit of having the additional parkland next to us. So our field trips, our summer camps, our summer music series can spill over into that natural park area. And it's a pretty special place.
Let's talk about the professional and volunteer workforce that is part of your ecosystem, because in these botanical gardens, in these parks, you basically have subject matter experts who are on staff, and they're various subject matter experts, everybody from financing to finance to marketing to fundraising, but you also have horticulturalists, you have people who are focused on the infrastructure, because you do need to have watering and irrigation in these parks. And then you have your volunteers. You have the people who love blooming flowers or cacti. You have people who love bonsai plants, right? You have all these different groups that form around these facilities. Talk about, and I'm not going to call on anyone. Just talk about how you bring people together to create this experience, both volunteers and staff. How does that work?
Well,
That's where the magic is, right?
Yeah.
and also the talent of bringing together a paid workforce and a volunteer workforce, because one gets paid, and the great joy of being a part of something that is a community and a give back. And they also have to find a place that feels welcoming. And so as our job as leaders of these public institutions and public gardens is finding that real job, not a fake job, a real job for the volunteers where they are contributing to our business model, they are contributing to our impact in our business day in and day out. And so that could be shadowing as a support for our educational programs. It could be in our retail section. It could be in the garden. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for volunteers. That's what it comes down to.
Isn't it? Right, Patrick? I mean, people want to be part of something. They want to interact. We're so isolated, right, Michelle?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I just hired an 80-plus-year-old retired trauma surgeon from Minneapolis to be my train manager. We have a train exhibit at the gardens. But the other skills that he's brought, he told me he always wanted to work with plants. If he hadn't been a doctor, he would have been a horticulturalist. So to gather that kind of expertise and passion amongst the people, I mean, it's just amazing. We've got about 150 volunteers that work with us regularly. But I do think that recruiting professional staff is difficult. Especially as you grow and you need a staff with different skills and deeper skills. We have an incredible retention rate. The joke is no one ever wants to leave the botanical garden, which is phenomenal. But when I think about expanding my accounting department, I don't know if graduates out of college think of, oh, I think I'm going to go work at a botanical garden and have a viable, well-paid career. Same thing with marketing. Of course, even horticulturalists. The nursery industry is attracting horticulturalists like crazy. And sometimes it's hard to compete with that, especially if you're a small or mid-size or intermediate-sized garden. So I don't know how my colleagues feel about recruiting, but it's
Well, even the large ones in the major metros, they're having really tough time finding the right people and keeping them. Patrick, you're nodding vigorously.
Yeah, I agree totally with what Michelle just said. It is really difficult. We're right now recruiting for a chief finance officer and a chief operations officer, which is a new position for us, the operations position anyway. And those are difficult in their own right, partially because of our location. You know, we're not in a metro area. You really have to choose to want to be here. And if you want to be here, it is the most fantastic lifestyle, and I highly recommend it. But it is so specific, and it's also expensive. It's seasonal. But when it comes to our horticulturists, that's really where we have to put the effort in, and it comes to investing in our staff really heavily in terms of training, because we are not in a position. You know, our garden, one of our gardens, the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Garden, is only open to the public for 8 weeks out of the year. It is a phenomenally intensive garden to manage and to run. It's very high level fine horticulture. That's not a skill set that a lot of people come with. And a lot of the people who have that skill set may prefer to live in a city. So finding the mix of personality who wants to be here, who has the skill set, that's very hard. And we have to redo that every year. We have a lot of seasonal people who come back year after year after year. But I think our job as leaders is to think, okay, is that a sustainable lifestyle for them? We've put the resources into training them in our way of gardening, and we have a very specific way of gardening. That you know, if you know how to grow plants, we can train you how to do things the way that we do them. But you know, if you're moving forward in your career, it's not necessarily going to work for you to be a seasonal employee at a garden that's open for 8 weeks a year. So how can we think outside the box and be a little bit more creative to keep people engaged and to offer them opportunities to stick around with us if they want to throughout a longer period in the year? And that's it. So it makes our business model really complicated. And, you know, you find almost there's like this summer slide phenomenon, you know, when students go off for the summer vacation and they come back and they've lost a lot of retention of what they used to know. It's sort of similar working with a very seasonal staff, is that you've got to find ways to keep them engaged throughout the year, because you're always playing catch up when you bring people back on, you know, after a period of time away. So it's tough, but it's just one of the challenges of leadership in an organization like this, to figure out what the right solution is. And I think it just comes down to investing as heavily as you can in your staff. Luckily at the Preserve, we have you know, a strong endowment that helps us to invest in staff the right way, in terms of pay and in terms of housing and things like that. But it's not easy, and it's fun. It's fun for us to think as leaders, what is the way that we solve these problems.
Are you all able to connect with people because gardening is such an in-person kind of a thing and a hands-on kind of a thing? It's not even, if I have a great work of art, I could give audiences exposure online. But gardening is kind of a different animal. Are you able to connect with people online through social media and so on to encourage them to visit, to engage with them, to inform them, to share some of the knowledge that you have if they can't come and visit this particular week? Does that work for you all, Michelle?
Yeah, you know, we had a do-it-yourself garden design class that we offered via Zoom. And we had our class participants ranged from England to Canada, all across the country. It was one of our more popular classes, and the response was very positive. Shockingly, they felt engaged, and they all had their garden designs for their specific locations. So we interact a lot through educational programming, and it's worked really well. social media is amazing too, as well.
And Stephanie, have you had success in that respect?
Well, the reality is the pandemic did great things for us to innovate, right? And Canada had very different restrictions than the US, and things were locked down for a lot longer. So we had to innovate longer and engage our audience longer remotely. We still do a little bit remote. It's hard to not have people together in person because we are places. We are community hubs. And so there is something about getting everyone to make a visit here and not just only being remote. We have a very active social media world. And one of the things that we try to focus on is to bring the personalities, bring the talent of our horticulturalist to life on our social media and give an inside scoop, right? Get somebody to hunger for wanting something more. We also have many opportunities to just share the beauty and get that hunger to come and be in this place. So yes, we can do it. We do it. It is an important way to connect, but it's not the only way.
And Patrick, what are you doing online, or is it just an in-person experience?
We're starting to do more online. It's sort of new for us, but we have in the summertime we do these really fantastic trail walks with our trail stewards, and they're really, really fun because you go and you learn how essentially park employees create really beautiful walking paths. And that sounds so technical, but it's actually really fun to go see how it's done, especially here where there's, massive boulders that have to be moved all by hand, and we quarry our own granite and do these really kind of wild things. And so you get to see that. And so how do you translate that to a digital online audience? And so one thing that we tried is just literally filming this, and turning it into a webinar, and it was incredibly popular. And so we started to do more of that. And we've also engaged, when you come to the preserve and you experience the quality of the horticulture here and you really are stepping inside of a work of art, it's an immersive experience and it's multisensory. So we're trying to figure out, okay, if we invest in film documentation that is as good as our horticulture is, maybe that's a way to kind of both showcase our culture and our values, and make people excited about the preserve and keep the preserve front of mind throughout the off season. So we're being experimental, but it's there's nothing like getting out in a kayak and like going and learning about loons. You have to do that in person.
Well, I just think it's really fascinating. You're all making lives worth living in your locations, right? It's the little things. It's the family time that you spend gardening or walking along a trail or learning something new. It's a real quality of life issue, and we sometimes neglect that in the rush of everyday living. Michelle Conklin, President and CEO of the Tucson Botanical Garden, Patrick MacRae, CEO of the Land and Garden Preserve in Seal Harbor, Maine, and Stephanie Jutila, CEO of the Toronto Botanical Garden. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Please thank your staffs, your volunteers, your donors, your communities, all the people who make this happen. It's really part of the fabric of our society, and we're so appreciative of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.